Welcome to Going Green, our weekly podcast, having a look at matters all about trying to make the place a better place to live in. And in this week, we've seen in the news people talking about getting rid of all the coal and the oil and trying to keep it in the ground, keep the increases or decreases now at 3%, even though they're still increasing, and trying to get down these emissions and get them down by 7.6% every year.
All right. Do you know how they calculated their 7.6%?
Yeah. Because what they needed to do, they worked out they needed to get rid of about 50% in the 2020s.
What, of CO2 emissions?
Yeah. So let's try and make this easier to understand, and I'll try and do a little bit of simple maths for you. Let's suppose we want to get rid of some of our CO2. So what a lot of the countries seem to be doing at the moment is they said, right, okay, what we're going to do, we're going to get rid of all of this by this date. And they haven't done anything yet. What they should be looking at is, if you're going to reduce your carbon emissions, let's get rid of some. So let's suppose we got 100% and I decide to get rid of 10% at the end of by this year. So at the end of this year, I've now got 90% of my stuff. Now, the next year, if I get rid of another 10%, this time I only get rid of 9%. Because it's 10% of 90 is only 9.
Yeah.
And so now I've got 91% of my original target. So the next year I can only get rid of
10% of 91.
Yeah.
Well,
and you see, so each year it gradually gets more and more difficult to get rid of some of the stuff.
I understand that sort of concept, obviously, because it gets, the more something gets smaller and smaller, it's harder to, scoop out. Think of a ladle, you're trying to scoop up,
The first ones are quite easy, but it's harder to get when you get down to the dregs. That's our basic problem, that if we want to cut down our emissions by, let's say, 10%, it's not that difficult if you've got quite a few people and firms and companies all together and say, right, we've got to try and reduce some, and they all have a go at doing a little bit, and they reduce it by quite happily 10%. It's then the next year you say, right, now we've got to reduce it, what you've got now, by another 10%. And they go, ooh, that's more difficult. And it's gradually going to get harder and harder to try and get down to net zero. And it isn't a case we really need to get down to net zero. We need to be doing better than that. But if we've got to try and get down to net zero, then really we've got to start, because the sooner you start, the easier it is, because you have to make less change, or you make the same amount of change, but you do it quicker. Because let's take Brexit, for instance. We had Brexit, and people were all talking about what's going to happen, what's going to go on. We're going to have this, that, and the other.
All these food shortages, all the, people.
And what really happened was, none of the above. And that's one of the problems that we also face with this losing our carbon, getting it down to net zero. A lot of people say, oh, we can't do this. Oh, no, look, our coal-fired stations are going to do this, that, and the other. And we're never going to manage to do that. Except, of course, if you replace them with wind turbines, the problem immediately went away. So it's using different technologies. And talking of different technologies, do you know what happened this week in Iceland, Paul?
Well, I actually do, because I was the one who told you.
Yeah, I know you did. Okay, so tell everyone what happened in Iceland on... Well, it was
this week.
It was this week. Yeah.
Week. Well, I say the largest, but it's the biggest so far. Carbon capture, I say machine technology.
They call it a plant. But yes, I don't like the word plant because it gives me the idea it's a big tree.
Well, in this respect, it really is sort of related to tree in regards to what they're doing is basically I say it's a normal carbon capture strategy, but it's a little different because of course where they are. So basically they suck in air, which contains CO2. They then release everything else but CO2. So now they've got CO2.
To me, that's the clever bit. How do you actually get rid of everything except the CO2?
Well, the answer is you put it into a sponge, and then you basically bake the sponge off, and everything. But you have to be very clever in your temperature. You're going to make sure it's just right, and everything bubbles. Yeah, I say bubbles off. Everything just gets away, and CO2 doesn't. It's still trapped. And then you take this sponge, and then after you've released all the air and all, not air, but everything but the CO2, you then crank up the heat, and then the CO2 vanishes. So now you've just got what is known as CO2 concentrate, which is concentrated CO2. Funny enough.
Yeah.
Right.
And what do you do with that?
So they then take that concentrate, and they pump it. I know it's air, and they pump it into water. They pour water, well, basically they mix water into it, which is as opposed to putting mixing CO2 with water. No, they put water into the CO2.
Yeah, okay.
Slightly different, but makes more sense. They then take this slurry, because which they now call it, and they pump it down into basalt rock.
Yeah.
And basically, because of Iceland's conditions, as in its geothermal potential, the basalt rock layer can holds it, but it also heats it up and actually boils the water away. It's not quite like boiling the water, but essentially they crystallize the CO2 or mineralize the CO2 into the basalt rock, which is essentially what how the oils were formed in the first place. So it's as I said, going back to the trees, this is doing exactly what the trees is, just more on a more man-made scale as opposed to naturally doing this. So they create this crystallized mineral basalt, this carbon infused basalt, and they then sort of say, we're going to wait 25 years to,
and you're just going to leave it down under the ground where it's going to be left for the next sort of, few millennia, and it'll be good.
So that's the idea. So going back to the ideas of the trees in regards to, it is very much the process which forms natural oils and things in the ground. Is you've got this decaying carbon and it basically mineralizes out, but we've managed to tweak the temperatures a little bit and manipulate the process so it will just crystallize or mineralize is what they use.
The word, yeah.
So it can actually form all these lovely juicy oils, which I know we'll probably dig up later. Or not.
Or not, yeah. So this is Orca, what we're talking about, made by a company called Climeworks. And I think they're a Swiss company. And they've got this state-of-the-art technology for trying to do this carbon capture. It's quite clever, but it's also controversial because people wonder how efficient it is and whether it really does work properly. They're talking about 4,000 tons of CO2. And I think the basic idea with this is they're going to have this machine trundling away, storing 4,000 tons of CO2, and other companies will pay for it as part of their carbon credit. So they might make sort of a few tons of carbon, and what they'll do is, if they buy those tons back from Iceland, it's like they're getting rid of them.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting policies. You sort of look at this and sort of go, well, I can't capture, but I can pay someone who's capturing electricity bill essentially to capture the equivalent CO2 there for me.
Yeah.
So that's essentially the business model of the plant itself. It's actually it's not itself trying to suck out CO2. It's basically offsetting other companies' CO2, saying, let's say you emitted 10 tons. This thing, I know it was only 4,000, whatever, but it's equivalent we paid your electricity to suck in that air, so therefore we feel better about ourselves as a corporate entity. Yeah. And it's sort of like going, well, if this approach to not necessarily offsetting carbon, because obviously they're still technically emitting, but they are paying for someone to put it back in the ground. So it is sort of, in a sense, economical. But if it's truly economical, as in the plant, the CO2 carbon capture plant is making, not making a money, but it's doing a benefit, and companies are happy to pay to offset their costs or offset their emissions, and it's a worthy cause, then we can slowly start seeing, well, underneath all the basalt areas, why don't we put more of these plants? Or on top of them, shall I say?
Yeah, one of the other reasons, of course, of trying to choose Iceland is that Iceland has all their sort of geothermal energy, and they generate basically a lot of free electricity. They can generate an awful lot more electricity than they can actually use. So they can use some of this to sort of be used for carbon capture with no problem. Yeah. Incidentally, which country in the world, Paul, has the highest use of electricity? Is it the UK, right, USA, or some silly little place I know, Iceland?
Using electricity, you say?
Yeah, per head. Now, how many? The amount of electricity used per head of person.
Well, I've got to say, surely it's got to be the USA.
And you're wrong. And I thought it had to be the USA because I thought, but it's Iceland.
You're telling me? Well, I suppose it's one of those things where,
because it's cheap.
It's cheap. They've got so much of it. They don't mind putting on 4 kettles all at once.
Yeah,
it's going to cost them the price of one.
A lot of houses in Iceland, sort of how warm are they in winter? And the answer is they're actually very warm. Why? Well, all their heat's coming from the geothermal energy.
The answer is sort of they've got underfloor heating.
So, well, yes, but they actually do pump water around, and so a lot of the country is sort of kept quite warm, I suppose, because it is so cold out there. Right, so that was one thing that came up, this idea of carbon capture, trying to sort of do this, because all this week we've seen things like talking about oil and gas production must decline, and we've been looking at the figures for last year and this year, and of course last year we hit something called the global pandemic, and surprisingly people used less petrol, oil, gas, because basically, well, they weren't traveling much. How many planes did you see last year? It was sort of, we played a game of spot the plane.
Yeah. But I read an interesting article about, in relation to that, is a sort of, but did we use less fuel last year, or through the pandemic, or at least the lockdown years of the world?
And the answer is we didn't really.
Yeah, surprisingly, we didn't, because we actually
we changed is what we did. We changed. We used different.
Yeah, so we use a lot more power or fuel to generate more power, because of course everybody was stuck at home instead of where people be commuting. See, but using their own fuel, if that makes any sense. They're buying the petrol elsewhere. So it's combination of economic effects,
which is why we saw the petrol prices absolutely drop, because they were so desperate to try and sell petrol. I was not really joking when I talked to my mechanic, and he said, "Cool, you haven't done many miles in the car, for this year for doing your MOT. I think it was like 50." And I said, "Yeah, I was off to go and fill the car up with petrol. It's annual fill up." And that's how bad it was last year. A little bit better this year. We are starting to go out a little bit more. But basically, we're looking at, although we're talking about this big drop that wasn't as much as everyone thought it was going to be, we're now seeing an increase. And what we should be seeing is a steady decline in the amount of oil, gas, and coal production. Yet it is still actually increasing. Yet the logic says if we want to try and get to net zero by 2050, we're trying to get this 1.5 degree Celsius rise. When I looked at that with 2050 and the rises, it was going to be about 2 degrees Celsius for that.
Yeah.
Cool. So
that's what they reckon. Looking at all the projections, they can say without policies, with the current policies, so what we need to do, and they were predicting, sort of, we would miss the 1.5 total heating, but we would actually just hit 2, but we wouldn't go, say, on to 3. 2 would be our maximum. So it's a shame missing that 1.5 target, but it's sort of, well, we have been working on, and yes, we'll hit 2 degrees of warming, but it won't be catastrophic as hitting 3 or even 4.
No, but we are still talking about floods, and we live in England, and we can expect that we're going to get some new beaches soon. Long as we don't have a beach near where I live, I don't mind, bearing in mind that we live sort of towards the centre of England. And if we had a beach in Hemel Hempstead, we saved a long drive, I suppose. But it's not quite what we want.
No.
Now, when we were looking at other things in the news this week, we heard a lot about sort of our trade agreement with Australia and various leaked documents to try and sort of embarrass the government and the Australian government, which I think they succeeded in doing, saying that they weren't taking those temperature things in a trade agreement.
I wouldn't
say Australia's Prime Minister?
Prime Minister, yes.
He said, well, he couldn't see what a trade and temperature had to do with anything, but...
well, it's hard to actually understand. It's one of those things where let's take a separate trade deal with the one we've got with, I think it's South Africa, but it might be another African country.
All right, yeah. So you don't know, yeah.
So okay. I don't truly know. It could be Zimbabwe or it could be the Kenyan one, because he did come over and they did strike some, talk some. Anyway. The idea, the principle behind the trade deal is we exchange goods and services, as in we buy Kenyan stuff, Kenyan buy British stuff. That's fair enough. And inside that trade agreement is both countries will attempt to reduce their emissions because, of course, we're putting more trade in. So obviously, if you're doing more trade and that costs all the emissions associated with transport, then you're going to reduce that. Fair enough. Yeah, and that's helped us do our climates and sort of reducing. If we help reduce the impact of the trade deal to the emissions, obviously that helps with the climate targets. And that's fair enough. There's no problem. That's easy. And it relates to the temperature by which, of course, it's the emission targets. It's a whole sort of act and clause. It's a mighty word of text. But essentially it means both sides, because they've increased trade, which is increased transport, and not necessarily emissions via production, but we'll glance over that. It's more, both sides will attempt to mitigate the emissions caused by the trade deal.
Yeah, sounds good.
Sounds good. Sounds fair enough. And both sides, and the inside it, if one side, because it doesn't have to be both sides fail. If one side fails to reduce their emissions or the offset their emissions then the trade deal shouldn't be allowed to go through, because of course, we're putting more emissions in. It's a bad idea. So that's where the trade deal will stop.
And that's what Australia didn't want.
So, so critically, And it's one of those things where Australia isn't going to meet its emissions reduction target. Or more importantly, in the trade deal, where they cannot reduce the emissions of that trade deal, say like that, as you said, by let's say 10% per year of the trade deal. Let's say that, and so basically means within like the first 2 years of the trade deal is going to be basically, I say, stopped. It's one of those things where it's going to be null and void, as in the trade deal will just vanish and have to be renegotiated. Everything. So what Australia has said, or negotiated, is saying we're not going to reach these climate goals, but we're working towards them. Instead of the over 2 years, we might be 4 years. We're lacking behind, but we're working towards it. But we're not going to meet the targets currently set. And you go, all right, there are two ways to do this. Either cut it out, which we've done, or you can change the targets. The problem is the targets relates to the Paris Agreement, which, of course, is the agreement made in COP. I can't remember which one it was.
Just call it the Paris Accord. We all know what you mean.
Yeah. So it follows the legislation of that. So because Australia's not doing so well at reducing, they're hopefully picking up and getting better. We're not saying they're not doing anything at all, but it's after approximately 2 to 3 years of doing this lovely trade deal, which is for a period of 25 years, it's going to be null and void.
Yeah.
So you've put all this effort in, and for 2 years it's trading, no problem, it's fine, and then it's stopped because, of course, Australia hasn't, I wouldn't say breached the trade deal. It's one of those things that's in the terms and conditions. They haven't been able to offset their emissions, so the language was changed, or said it would be, instead of being explicit that they have to follow the climate accords and reduce their CO2, it'd be implicit, as in they're working on it slowly, and slowly than the UK is, obviously, but they're working towards it, and the trade deal hopefully would allow them to increase it further, because we could sell them wind turbines, all those lovely sort of things.
So why is Australia not so sort of good on their sort of renewable energy? I thought, in my stupidity, that Australia would be quite good because it's very sunny. When you were out in Australia, you said that it was nice and warm and sunny there.
Yeah, it's apparently it's got this is 8 hours, average of 8 hours worth of daylight sunshine, whereas the UK's only got 3.8. Just to give you, which means, of course, if I've got solar panels out there, they're going to get nearly double the power output,
or even more.
Even more than the current UK ones, which is great. That'd be fabulous. The major problem is, of course, photovoltaic cells. These are the solar panels, essentially. They get hot in doing the conversion from sunlight to electricity. Australia's already hot, so you're basically having a hot object heat up and
get hotter.
And unfortunately, the efficiency of doing the conversion from light to electricity at, say, high temperatures, we were talking, say, 40, 50 degrees, reduces dramatically, is down dramatically, to the point of the current officially here in the UK with the current set of temperatures is around, I wouldn't say 35%, it's something like that. It dramatically drops down all the way down in Australian temperatures down to, say, 2%, or that sort of level, which means only in winter, where it's cooler, would it actually be worth it, as opposed to summer, where it's too hot to run them, and you basically need to put covering over to protect them, which is, it's not saying it's more effort, but it's just not worth the long term. They should be just put on and forget.
So they need different types of solar cells or different technology.
Yeah, exactly. And we're working out. We watched a documentary in around California's new solar. I wouldn't say a solar tower because it wasn't a tower. It was basically just solar mirrors heating an oil or thing.
And then using that heat energy to be stored. But it's great in a place like California. I understand there's sun there, whereas you come to, cloudy, rainy, miserable England, we're sort of lucky to see the sun. We did see the sun this week. We had 2 days of sort of warm sunshine, and then we're back to rain again.
Yeah, I know. It's one of those things. But you could use that technology, this to heat the stuff out in Australia. And I say that's what they're attempting to do. It's one of those things. It's quite expensive to do, but they're slowly working on it. You look at the other critical thing, a part of the Australian climate, or not necessarily climate, but their power grid. Ready? They're the third world leader on the amount of coal power stations, and that's behind China and Poland, because that's just how it works. And critically, so obviously they still burn a lot of coal, and they produce a lot of coal. They produce all the coal
a lot for China.
So it's one of those things. And going through that, they go, well, coal's not good, and they've got the better coal as opposed to places like Poland, who are
Germany and Poland. They've got lignite.
They've got the good coal. They go, right, we're going to change from coal over to gas. The natural gas, which is effectively what we did. Not necessarily for the reasons
they're doing it. Yes, that was about 30 years ago, wasn't it?
You mean 40?
Yeah. I'm just getting old. I can't remember.
Yeah. So anyway, so they're converting from all their coal power stations into gas power stations. Well, that's basically just changing the fuel. Not very much. The major problem they've got is where are they getting the gas? Or the natural gas.
Well, you see, I know in the UK we've got this big gas fields in the North Sea. Do they have any sort of areas like the North Sea to grab hold of gas from?
It's not really, but they're more getting it from
coal.
Unfortunately, burning coal. Basically making coal gas, and which isn't very good. But there's a little bit out in the. Is it the Indo-Asian Pacific or whatever? The bit above Australia. Let's just call it that.
Yeah, you're good on your geography of Australia. Bearing in mind you lived there for a while.
Yeah, who knows what the economic...
You lived in the other corner, I know.
I know, yeah. So it's one of those things where it's above them. But of course, there is not that much natural gas out there, And the critical thing, of course, is actually getting it. You look how many I say oil rigs, but, the gas, whatever, let's just call them oil rigs out in the North Sea, right? Loads of them. No problem. Easy. How many are there in that area? The answer is not many, because, of course, there aren't that many.
There's not so much defined, which makes it more difficult. So, where are we then? We've got this idea of trying to reduce the amount of oil and gas. We're supposed to be reducing it by 3% minimum a year, but no one is. Everyone's sort of putting it up. I know the UK, we've got this coal mine that they're thinking about, and they've got this new oil sort of...
field, or is
oil field, just north of Scotland, and they're still thinking about what do we do with that? Do we actually bring that online?
Yeah, it's a hard thing to actually describe why and what they're trying to do. And the obviously answer is that the reason for those are not for fuel, although technically the oil field would be for fuel. But, it's unfortunately how it is. But we're more talking, so the coal mine is not going to be, it says in the thing, it's not going to, all the coal's not going to be used for burning. It's going to be used for other things, which is,
chemicals,
plastics, and all sorts of things.
Which we also want to get rid of.
Yeah, but we can't, but we're currently buying the coal from places like, I say Poland, but it is buying coal from elsewhere and importing it, and we don't know the quality of, well, we do know the quality of the coal, and the answer is not very good. Whereas we've got much higher quality coal, and we sort of, if we can get the coal ourselves, we can obviously then make sure that we only take out as much as we need, and we can also do a lot of offsetting and sort of, checking of the regulations to make sure that we're not basically just ripping it out of the ground. We're being very conservative in the approach.
Yeah. Right. Anyway, we've done our 30 minutes chat on Going Green, our weekly podcast looking at matters all green and whatever. We will see you back here next week when we'll look at more that's gone on in the week and other topics about trying to make this world a better place to live in. And so from me, Philip, and from
me, Paul,
it's goodbye from us until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.